Hello, all my cool cats and kittens. Today we're going to talk about listening, and I'm going to get right into it because I only have 15 minutes and I want to cover 4 different types of listening. So, we're going to talk about all 4 types of listening in the following ways. We're going to talk about the purpose, the cognitive effort associated, the behaviors associated, physiological response, and finally, examples. So let's first talk about listening for enjoyment. The purpose of this type of listening is simply to bring joy or for entertainment. And so some examples of what you might be listening to for enjoyment is you may be listening to music is probably the most often one. You may have television like The Office or something, or Friends, or something that you've seen a lot of. You may have that playing in the background while you're doing other things. And if you're not actively engaged in it, then it's most likely listening for enjoyment or entertainment. And even if you are actively engaged with it, it may also be that kind. And we'll talk about why in just a few minutes. So in this type of listening, you're having to put forth very little cognitive effort, which means you're not having to think or process information, as much information as some of the other forms of listening. In fact, you're processing very little of it. Now, if you're a music major, you may be processing and having more cognitive effort than someone who's not a music major or who doesn't play instruments or doesn't know how to read music would. But for the most part, as a whole, we typically put forth the least amount of cognitive effort in enjoyment, listening for enjoyment. So let's talk about what behaviors are associated with listening for enjoyment. Oftentimes, you may participate in other things while you're listening for enjoyment. You may be doing schoolwork, you may be dancing, you may be driving, or doing a variety of different things. So you're highly susceptible to distraction in this type of listening. So you may be very distracted. You may not be actually responding in any way to what you're listening to, whether that's verbally or non-verbally. You're not making eye contact necessarily with the source of the music or the source of what you're listening to. There's no call and response of any sort really in this form of listening. So you're going to more likely be relaxed unless you're studying or doing something where you're actively engaged. So your nonverbal communication will be more relaxed. Let's talk about your physiological response. Your heart rate, as long as what you're listening to is soothing and not distracting, your heart rate will go down. You will start to feel your blood pressure going down. Your muscles will relax as opposed to feeling tense. Those are some of the physiological responses that you'll experience. So this is the type of listening that is really, really easy. It's not something that you actually need to be trained to do. We naturally do that. We naturally listen for enjoyment. So now that we've talked about listening for enjoyment, let's move on to comprehensive listening. So the purpose of this listening is to understand what you're hearing, to understand what you're listening to. So for a music major, that could very much be music. But for everyone else, this may be the type of listening that you're doing in a classroom. You're not necessarily trying to make a judgment. You're trying to understand what you're hearing. So you will be putting forth a little bit more cognitive effort than the listening for enjoyment, but still not heightened. And you'll see why in just a moment when we're talking about the behaviors associated with this type of listening. In this type of listening, you're more apt to actually engage with what you're listening to. So you may ask questions, but those questions are typically going to be closed-ended or to get clarification, or they can be open-ended if you're really struggling to understand what you're listening to. You are going to typically be geared towards what you are listening to. So your body will actually be pointing towards what you're listening to. So right now your body's probably tilted towards the computer because that's what you're listening to. Hopefully making eye contact with the speaker. You may be asking questions like I already said, but you're still going to be susceptible to distraction because depending on what the outcome of that information is, what you're going to be doing with that information later, will dictate how engaged you are in what you're listening to. So at this point, you may not be very engaged to what you're listening to because you may not have bought into the importance of understanding the different types of listening. So your physiological response, your heart rate's going to be higher, and your blood pressure, you're going to be a little bit more tense than that listening for enjoyment that we already talked about. So examples of this would be for music majors listening to music. It could be you sitting in a classroom. It could be you watching a political debate and trying to understand what are the issues. It could be watching the news. It could be listening to directions from your boss or listening to a presentation in your field. All of those could be things that you are listening for comprehension or comprehensive listening. So the third type of listening is critical listening. So in this form of listening, you are listening to make a judgment or to respond. So this takes more cognitive effort. However, you're more likely to take shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts in this form of listening. So you may be paying attention to buzzwords that either directly align with your preconceived beliefs and understanding or that contradict or are on the other side or of the opposite perspective that you already have. And so that may lead you to kind of filter how you're understanding and your cognitive effort through that lens of, oh, I agree with the majority of what this person is saying, or I agree with this idea, so I'm going to agree with everything. So instead of thinking through what's actually being said, you're more likely to just cling on to those words that you either strongly agree with, or phrases that you strongly agree with, or phrases that you strongly oppose. So your physiological response is most likely going to be even more heightened. You may have a higher heart rate, higher blood pressure. Your muscles may begin to get more tense than they were before you came into the interaction. Some behaviors may be that you are pointing away from what you're listening to, especially if you disagree with what they're saying or with what you're hearing. You may be susceptible to be disengaged or to be distracted if you don't agree with what's being said. You may ask questions, but typically they're either to kind of either lead into you making an argument or to you proving them wrong in some way or to make them look foolish. So they're going to be like gotcha questions. So you're very much listening to make a response. Some examples of this may be if you compete in debate, you're probably doing some critical listening. Maybe some comprehensive listening too at times, but the majority of the time in a debate, you're probably critically listening. If you're listening to a political debate, you may be doing this form of listening. If you are listening to something for a class that you already really just don't like, or a teacher that you don't like, you're more likely to be critically listening than comprehensively listening. Or if you feel like you're already an expert on the topic that's being covered, you're more likely to be critically listening than comprehensively listening. I do want to make a note that we tend to also do this when we're in an argument with someone. However, this type of listening is very harmful to relationships. And so it takes some untraining to move from critically listening to the type of listening that we're about to talk about, which is empathetic or empathic listening. So in this form of listening, the purpose is to understand the other person, not just what they're saying, but how that informs and explains and is a representation of how they're viewing themselves in that moment. And so you're going to be really, really focused, in tune. This is going to require a lot of cognitive effort because you're not just listening to what they're saying, but how they're saying it. You're going to be in tune to their affect. Do they look different than they normally do? Do they look disheveled when they normally are put together? Do they look put together when they're normally more disheveled? Do they look like they've lost a lot of weight or gained a lot of weight recently? How is that informing what they're saying? So you're aware of much more than just what's being said. You're in tune to their nonverbal communication just as much, if not more, than their verbal communication. So that's why there's a lot of cognitive effort taking place in this form of listening. And it's the one that we typically don't do as much, but we should be doing the most in relationships. So let's talk about the behaviors. You may be asking questions, but they're going to be more focused on, they're going to be open-ended first. You may ask for clarification, but the majority of your questions are going to be open-ended, geared towards better understanding who they are, how what they're talking about influences them, how that communicates what they're feeling, and getting clarification and getting a better understanding of who they are and how they see themselves. This is the kind of listening where there actually may be some physical touch involved. Your proximity is probably going to be a little bit closer. So you may actually be in a very short distance away from someone. You may give them a hug in this form of listening. You may put a hand around their shoulder. You may touch their hand or their leg, or depending on your relationship with them. There's more likely to be some type of physical touch in this form of listening than some of the others. So let's talk about physiological response. So this type of listening has an impact not just on the listener's physiological response, but the person being listened to. So both parties typically feel a reduction in heart rate, they feel a reduction in blood pressure, and they feel their muscles relaxing, which sounds counterintuitive, but this is also the type of listening that happens in a therapeutic or a counseling session. And so it makes sense that both the listener and the person being listened to experience that physiological response, counter to what the others do. So examples of what instances you might be participating in this form of listening could be a therapeutic, obviously. This is the type of listening that counselors and therapists are trained in. This is the type of listening that you should be doing with your friends and family and acquaintances and people that you want to develop relationships with, or people that you're just interacting with on a daily basis. This is kind of the golden standard for what type of listening is good for maintaining and growing and positively influencing relationships. So you're going to see a discussion board on this type of listening. So I want you to not only post on this board in response to the questions that I raise and that I ask, but I also want you to respond to two others' posts. So after you post and after the due date for that, your initial post passes, you will be assigned two people to respond to, and then you'll have another due date for when to respond to those. And so make sure that you do those. I'll send that information out in an announcement as well to remind you to do so. Other than that, that's listening in a very quick nutshell. If you have questions, feel free to post them in that discussion board as well. All right. Talk to you soon, folks. Bye-bye.